Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this 7 p.m. showing of our Phasing Out Gasoline webinar. We'll be talking about both Massachusetts and Rhode Island today with basically up-to-the-minute live updates, so we're really glad you could join us. If we can go to the next slide. Yes, some logistics before we get started. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but we would absolutely love to take your questions and comments. So please go ahead throughout the webinar and type in any questions or comments you have into the chat box that you should see on your GoToWebinar console, and we'll get to them in breaks at the end of the presentation. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording and slides afterwards. So feel free to not hastily take notes or share it with friends after the webinar is over. But with that, we can launch right in. My name is Anna van der Spek, and I am the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I'm joined today by my colleague Mal, who is our Transportation Program and Policy Coordinator. Green Energy Consumers Alliance, if you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization doing work in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is to harness our power as energy consumers to speed the transition to a low-carbon future. What that means is we run a series of programs and services that help people access clean energy technologies, and then we take what we learn by interacting directly with people and also suppliers in different energy markets to inform the advocacy work that we do at the state and local level. So Mal and I both work on our Drive Green program, which helps people access electric vehicles. And we also do our transportation advocacy work in both states, which is what we're here to talk about today. Excuse me. Today, we are going to run through a fair amount of material pretty quickly, but it's all exciting, so I think it should be fun. We will start with an introduction to Massachusetts and Rhode Island climate goals and also emissions. We'll then talk about what this phasing out idea really means. What is a phase out of gasoline? And we'll roll pretty quickly into answering the question of, is a phase out starting in 2030 possible? Then we'll talk about legislation in Rhode Island and also updates in Massachusetts. The Senate in Massachusetts is literally still debating and voting on amendments on the climate bill as we speak. So we'll do our best to give you up-to-date information on that front. And then we'll end with a Q&A to hopefully get to all of your questions. So with that, I think we can roll right into part one. So in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and in much of the country, transportation is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. In Massachusetts, the transportation sector as a whole accounts for 42% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions, and it is a sector that is not really decreasing. So it's definitely one of the harder nuts to crack if we really want to reduce our emissions to meet our climate goals in 2030 all the way through 2050. This pie chart shows us the breakout of that 42% slice, the transportation emissions, and where they come from. And you can see that the bulk of the transportation emissions come from light duty vehicles. In Massachusetts, at least, there's 5.5 million vehicles on our roads. Mal can give us the number for Rhode Island, which I don't have at the top of my head. But every single one of those vehicles driving to and from work or the grocery store is contributing to these greenhouse gas emissions, not to mention all of the localized air pollution that also has dramatic effects on public health. The next biggest slice is medium and heavy duty vehicles. So this is anything from a pickup truck up to a cement mixer. And then 12% is aviation, marine, and rail. A big takeaway that we have from this is that we need to clean up all of these slices, but the light duty vehicles one is a really big one that we need to tackle aggressively if we want to meet our goals. We can go on to the next slide. And I'll pass it on to Mal, who can also tell us how many cars there are in Rhode Island.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say there are about 800,000 light duty cars in Rhode Island, so not nearly as much as in Massachusetts, but pretty much the total percentage of pollution that comes from those light duty vehicles is pretty comparable as in Massachusetts. And so we know there's absolutely no way to meet our climate goals without focusing on cars. And so this slide that we have on the screen here, I think does a pretty good job of showing what the emissions benefits are by switching to an electric vehicle under the current electricity system. So you see at the top there, the average gas-powered car releases about 381 grams of carbon emissions per mile driven. And you can decrease that substantially if you transition to a plug-in hybrid, which is an electric vehicle with a gas backup, which drives part of its miles on electricity and part of its miles on gasoline. But the real kind of benefit of switching to electric cars is the fact that not only are they cleaner now, if you're looking at a fully electric vehicle, which is all the way at the bottom there, it's only 84 grams of carbon emissions for every mile driven. There's actually substantial room for improvement. So as the electricity mix gets cleaner every year because of the renewable energy laws that we have on the books, the electric cars that we put on the road today are going to get cleaner over time. So this is pretty different from a gas-powered car, which if it has 20 mpg today, it's going to have 20 mpg 10 years from now. Electric cars are really unique in the sense that their emissions will actually decrease over time because of how much cleaner the electricity mix is getting. So in terms of being able to decrease that portion of the pie for light duty cars and the emissions that they're responsible for, this is a really clear strategy to being able to make that happen. There's also other benefits to electrifying vehicles. So there's substantial public health impetus to be able to transition our system to electricity. A recent report from the American Lung Association estimates that about 22 billion in health costs are going to be saved through the overall transition to electric vehicles. And that mostly comes from avoided health costs because we're not contributing as much to air pollution because there's no tailpipe emissions from electric cars. And so that leads to less incidence of asthma, leads to less respiratory conditions, less incidence of emphysema, and lots of other conditions that create a burden on our healthcare system. And so there's substantial untapped avoidable health costs there. There's also the benefit of more stable and lower fuel costs for drivers. I know that gas prices are kind of on a downward tilt right now, but lots of people have been struggling with the additional costs of gasoline because that price really fluctuates over time through no control of our own. And so the transition to EVs is going to allow us to be able to have more consistent fuel costs for our vehicles. And then finally, there's larger macroeconomic benefits to switching to electric cars as well, because Massachusetts and Rhode Island don't produce petroleum or refine it. And so for every dollar that we spend on gasoline, most of it flows out of our state's economies because we don't have any part of the petroleum refining or producing process. Whereas if you compare that to electricity, a lot of electricity, all electricity is generated locally. And so those benefits stay in our economy and create jobs and have other benefits. So the impetus for switching to electric cars it expands far beyond the environmental benefits. But of course, at Green Energy Consumers, we're very excited about the environmental benefits. And in particular, note that in Massachusetts' initial draft of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, there was a goal to get around 750,000 to 1 million EVs on the road by 2030 in order to stay in line with the state's climate goals. Now, there's an updated version of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that puts that number right at 900,000 in order to increase the emissions reduction potential from the transportation sector. This is particularly important because Massachusetts dropped out of the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program, or TCI, which would have helped reduce emissions and create a funding source in order to continue to support the transition to electric cars. But we don't have that program on the table anymore. And so as advocates, we're looking at Massachusetts' very ambitious goal to get nearly 1 million EVs on the roads by 2030, and we don't see the policies in place in order to make that happen. So our question is, what is Plan B to get 1 million electric cars on the road so that we can stay in line with our climate goals and achieve all of those benefits that I was talking about? And so just to better visualize the scale of increase that needs to happen in order to stay in line with Massachusetts climate goals, you can see in the graph there, the blue bars are historical EV sales every year. So there's been, relatively steady increases over the last couple of years, particularly a pretty big jump from 2020 to 2021. But even if we continue on that trajectory and EV sales increase by about 2% every year, we're only going to have about half as many electric cars on the road as we need in order to stay in line with the state's climate goals. So it's clearly not enough. We really want to stay on track to that green line that is the ramp up to get 1 million electric cars by 2030. And so our concern at Green Energy Consumers is that there are not policies in place in order to make that a reality. And there's a similar story in Rhode Island. So last year, the state passed its first law that makes its climate targets mandatory. Massachusetts has had mandatory climate reduction goals since, I think, 2016, and Rhode Island didn't pass them until 2021. So the state is now very quickly having to figure out how it's going to meet its first target in 2030 to reduce emissions by 45% compared to 1990 levels. A plan to reach that goal is due at the end of 2022. And so in Rhode Island, we're eagerly awaiting to see what is going to be included there. But we know that electric vehicles are going to have to be a major component of that plan, because transportation is the largest source of emissions. You can see it's pretty substantial at 35% of the total climate warming emissions that come out of the state. And so electric vehicles are going to have to be a major component. But similarly, there have not been very many electric cars sold in Rhode Island, and the ramp up to reach what we think is going to be necessary to stay on pace with Massachusetts is extremely high. Again, we don't have the policies in place to be able to get there, and Rhode Island also has the disadvantage of being a couple of years behind Massachusetts. So Green Energy Consumers is wondering, how do both states achieve these very ambitious but doable goals in order to achieve what's necessary to address the climate crisis? And our solution, what we believe is the best path forward, is a policy that would phase out gasoline starting in 2030. I know that might sound a little outlandish or hard to swallow, but we actually think it's a very reasonable policy to move us forward in the next decade, and it's absolutely necessary, not just for 2030, but achieving our much larger climate goals in 2050. So, what does it mean to phase out gasoline? The first thing to know about vehicles is that they last a very long time on the roads. The average lifetime for a car is 11 years. And that means that a car can be on the road for 15 or 20 years. And so every gasoline-powered car that we're putting on the roads now is committing us to decades of additional pollution. And so a phase out of gasoline is really a simple commitment to try and put the policies in place to make sure that 100% of new car sales starting in 2030 are electric. This would allow plug-in hybrids, and so we think it's a very reasonable goal and doable with current technology. And the important thing to remember is that a policy like this would only be affecting new cars. So it's not a cash for clunkers type of situation where you're removing existing gasoline powered cars. It's really just trying to make it so that the new vehicles that we're putting on the roads are clean ones that don't lock us into decades of additional carbon pollution. And so you can see on these charts here, a phase out starting in 2030 is really the beginning of a long process in order to switch all of the vehicles that are on the roads today to being cleaner versions. So in the graph in orange on the left, you can see there's a phase out starting in 2035 depicted. So there's an increase in sales all the way through 2035, at which point most of the vehicles being sold are electric. And then on the right, you see a chart that shows under that scenario what the total mix of vehicles on the road looks like. So you can see even when all of the new cars being put on the road are electric, it takes a long time to phase out those gasoline vehicles because of how long they last on the road. So that means even when 100% of new vehicle sales are electric, it's still a very slow transition that allows us to prepare for charging infrastructure and our grid capacity and all of those things. So this is why we think it's really important to start a phase out in 2030, because even when we make all vehicle sales electric, it takes a long time for that fleet to turn over. And so this is absolutely necessary in order for us to decrease our gasoline dependence as quickly as possible. We also think this is a really fair way to approach electric vehicle adoption because new car buyers tend to be higher income. The average cost of a new car in 2019 was about $40,000. Which is much higher than a lot of people realize, in part because new car buyers tend to be going for those more expensive models. And that number has actually increased to much higher than that, $47,000 in 2022, because of how expensive new cars have gotten due to supply chain issues. So we think that a phase out of new gas-powered cars is a fair way to ensure that the supply of cars coming in is clean, because the car buyers tend to be higher income. And so this is not a burden that's going to fall on low and moderate income consumers who would maybe struggle to afford the cost of a new electric car in the next couple of years. It's also worth noting that the majority of Americans never buy a new car in their lifetime. So a phase out of new gasoline powered cars is a policy that would only affect a small proportion of people, while making sure that there's a steady supply of secondhand electric cars on the market for everyone else. Finally, this is an idea that is gaining traction. So in addition to legislation that's been proposed in Rhode Island to phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars starting in 2030, there's also been a long-time commitment by California for the past 2 or 3 years to start a phase-out date starting in 2035. New York also passed legislation that set a date to phase out the sale of gas-powered cars starting in 2035. And Washington State most recently passed legislation that moved that phase-out date up to 2030. And so we believe the 2030 date is the right date for Massachusetts and Rhode Island because it is an aspirational goal, it's not binding. And so the idea is that the more ambitious the date that we set, the better we can plan for our charging infrastructure and all of the necessary policies that are necessary to increase electric car adoption to the extent that's needed to meet our climate goals. So that means shooting at 2030 gives us the best possible chance of actually landing at 2035 and staying on track with all of those commitments that both states have made. And so really the point of the 2030 date is not to establish a mandate, but rather to mobilize our planning efforts commensurate with what's needed to reach those targets for electric car adoption. And of course, the United States is not alone in the transition to electric cars. There are countries all over the world that have established their own phase-out dates for the sale of new gasoline-powered cars, including a few countries that I believe have established dates for 2025. And so this idea is gaining traction globally, and it's a good indicator of where the electric car market is going. So it's not just Massachusetts and Rhode Island. This is part of a much larger technological movement that indicates that electric cars are here to stay, and we need to be able to prepare for them adequately. Finally, we think the 2030 phase-out date is appropriate because that's what the majority of Massachusetts voters are thinking. We partnered with an organization called Cultura that conducted a survey to assess whether Massachusetts voters and voters all across the country think it's feasible to phase out the sale of gasoline starting in 2030. And in fact, most people think that 2030 is the right date. 62% of the Massachusetts respondents that were polled thought that 2030 was an appropriate time to start phasing out new gasoline-powered car sales. And I'll note that the survey that we conducted indicated that most people underestimated the cost savings, including fuel and maintenance, as well as all of the other benefits associated with electric cars. So clearly people are ready to make the switch to EVs, even while underestimating all of the potential cost and economic benefits that there are in this transition. So we think that this is a really appropriate target date for policy. Finally, before I switch it back to Anna, I do want to talk a little bit more about the technology and market outlook, because we at Green Energy Consumers believe that not only is the 2030 date appropriate for the level of planning and infrastructure development that needs to happen in order to make it feasible, but we also think that the EV market will be ready to support the needs of all drivers who are going to be buying new cars in 2030. There's really good modeling that shows that the upfront purchase price of new electric cars is going to fall significantly in the next couple of years. If you've paid attention to the electric car market, you'll know that electric cars have been getting much better in terms of range and charging speed than anyone would have expected just 5 or 6 years ago. And that's because of improvements in battery technology. So while batteries have been getting better, they've also been getting cheaper, and that trend is outpacing the pace of how solar is dropping in cost. So it's a really substantial drop in cost. And so you can see globally, the estimate is that electric cars are going to be as comparable to price as a gasoline-powered car around 2025 to 2027, depending on the size of the car. Obviously, larger cars that have larger batteries tend to need a little bit extra time to become price comparable, but even then, 2027 is expected to be the latest date in which we see that price parity. And so, you know, we're proposing a phase out of new gas-powered cars 3 years after electric cars become cheaper. So for this reason, we expect that the technology is going to be accessible to all new car buyers starting in 2030. And finally, before I turn it back to Anna, you can see the momentum that's building in the electric car market based on the number and increasing pace of commitments that automakers are making in order to keep up with where they expect the electric car market is going. So here's a list of legacy car makers. So these are car makers that have never specialized in producing electric cars, but are now investing serious money into making sure that they are producing the kinds of cars that they know consumers are going to want, and they know is going to be appropriate considering all of the different commitments that states and countries have made to decrease carbon emissions. So as an example, I'll just briefly highlight Ford, which has invested, which is going to invest $22 billion in its electric car division through 2025 through its production of the electric Ford F-150 pickup truck, as well as other vehicles. So these are commitments that can't easily be undone depending on who's in the Oval Office or who's president. These are, you know, serious investments in order to not just research and design new electric vehicles, but produce them in a massive, massive way. So considering all of the commitments that have been made and the extent to which they've been made across the auto industry, we feel extremely confident that by 2030, the market is going to be mostly catering to people who want to buy electric cars.
Thanks, Mal, for that tour through all the reasons why we've been working on this. I'll switch now from why we think this is a good idea and a valid approach to what exactly we have been doing and will continue to do in Massachusetts specifically. So Massachusetts has the benefit of many legislators who understand that climate is an issue and something we need to move forward on. And there have been a lot of ideas put forth in this legislative session about what to do about transportation emissions. This presentation so far has really focused on personal passenger vehicles because they are the largest chunk of that transportation sector emissions. But more broadly, we think a lot of things need to happen to bring down those emissions. So in Massachusetts, what we've been focusing on is getting legislation through that touches on these 8 key principles that are about what Mal has just talked about, but also broader to really shift everything that is roaming around our streets on wheels, combusting a fossil fuel to something electric. So I won't read through these word for word, but basically we think that for transportation electrification legislation to be comprehensive and touch on everything it needs to touch on, it would need to set a goal that we will phase out gas-powered cars by 2030, institute a timeline to electrify public fleets, particularly public transit and school buses. We've had other webinars where we talk about the particular public health benefits of targeting medium and heavy duty vehicles and anything that runs on diesel fuel. So we think that has to be part of our approach. The third key point is to plan out charging infrastructure. Right now, our charging infrastructure gets built out depending on what our electric utilities propose and what market actors like ChargePoint or EVgo or Electrify America want to install. What we think we need is someone at the state level who has our 2030 and 2040 and 2050 emissions reduction goals front of mind to go, what do we need? What do we need to build out charging infrastructure? Where do these stations need to go? And what is the most efficient way to get these stations in the ground in a way that everybody has access to them? So our third bullet is around doing that planning and making sure that supporting policies get put in place to make that happen. Across the board, we want to prioritize overburdened and underserved communities, specifically, for example, starting with buses that serve environmental justice communities or communities that are particularly transit dependent, and making incentives for the purchase of electric vehicles like our More EV state rebate more accessible by making it point of sale, extending it to used vehicles, and making a higher incentive, excuse me for the pause there, for lower or moderate income drivers. So there's lots of ideas in that fourth bucket. What I just mentioned about the More EV rebate is bucket number 5, and then there are a couple of other policies we think are key. One is to direct our electric utilities to offer time varying rates that basically incentivize EV drivers to charge when demand is low, which is good for drivers, but also good for everyone because it makes better use of our grid. And then we absolutely need to support the electrification of private fleets and incorporate EV charging into building code. So I said I wasn't going to read through all of those, but then I did anyway. But these are the key principles that have been reflected in a lot of bills and that we've been spending a lot of time talking about with advocates and legislators. So a lot of what I'm about to talk about is now we've had to pivot a little bit given developments in the last week, but I'll talk about it as if the last week hasn't happened, and then we'll give updates from the last week. So one thing that we have done recently is taken those key principles and the text of a lot of existing bills that are either in the Transportation Committee or TUE, Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy, and sort of put together a Frankenstein bill that draws on the strong pieces from all of those existing bills, and circulated that as sort of model legislation. So that model legislation had four main buckets. The first defined a 2030 goal and put four parts to that goal. So first, by 2030, we wanted the Commonwealth to commit to having all new light-duty vehicle purchases be electric, all public fleet purchases be electric, the whole MBTA bus fleet be electric, with the RTAs following a couple years later, and 30% of medium and heavy duty vehicles being electric. And that last bullet has to do with a multi-state memorandum of understanding that Governor Baker signed a couple years ago. So part one was just defining 2030 goal as those four pieces. The second part was about implementing some no regrets policies that we know we need to do. The first was to, again, make the more EV purchase rebate more effective and more equitable by making it point of sale, extending it to used vehicles, adding an adder for lower or moderate income drivers, and continuing the incentive for medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. And then the second bullet was to implement those time varying rates for EV charging, which we know are just a good idea, good for EV drivers and non-EV drivers alike. The third part was to direct the state to really think about where we are now, where we need to be in 2030, and figure out what policies we need to implement to get us from here to 2030, specifically on the charging infrastructure side, but also in terms of vehicle adoption. And that scoping plan was also supposed to take a really close look at the distribution of burdens and benefits and figure out how can we make this transition serve the most people well and make sure nobody's left behind. And then finally, the fourth part of this model legislation was that by 2025, the state would issue regulations that are consistent with federal law and following the recommendations of that scoping plan to actually make it possible to realize the 2030 goal defined in the first part. So this is the approach that we have been taking, trying to tie together passenger vehicles with fleets, with medium and heavy duty vehicles, and really bring the Commonwealth to a point where we have a comprehensive approach to transportation electrification to meet our 2030 climate goal. So if we move on to the next slide, the state caught us by surprise last week. So we have been speaking to legislators on both in the House and the Senate for weeks about what might be included in a climate bill. The House a couple weeks ago now issued a bill that has to do with offshore wind and workforce. And what we had heard was that the Senate was working on a broader climate bill that would come out maybe around Earth Day. Instead, it came out on Thursday, and we were given the legislators were given a deadline of Monday to file amendments. This bill, if you haven't read about it, is a pretty large bill that touches not just on transportation, but also buildings, and basically is the way that the state wants to meet the climate goals set forth in last year's climate roadmap bill that, as Mal mentioned earlier, upped the emissions reductions target for 2030 to 50%. So there's lots and lots of measures in this bill. The Senate wants to dedicate $250 million for clean transportation, electricity, and heating. 100 million of those they want to put towards the More EV rebate program that we've mentioned a couple of times. So basically, this bill landed on senators' desks on Thursday. They were given until Monday to file amendments. They filed 155 amendments, which I learned today is the largest number that have ever been filed for a non-budget bill. And today, literally still as we speak, there is a hearing where senators are debating the bill text itself and then also all of these amendments. So there again, there are 155 amendments. There are lots of good ones. These are the ones that you might have gotten an email from us about that we spoke with senators to support, but also asked our networks to reach out to their senators to support. I really won't go through these one by one this time. The top two are the ones that we helped file with Senator Jamie Eldridge. The first puts in more specific language about the state directing electric utilities to offer time varying rates or off-peak charging rebates that fully account for all of the benefits of charging off-peak. That one, the last I heard, was merged with another one that was also about time varying rates, and I believe has not been voted on yet, but the prognosis was good. The second one would establish a goal that all new cars that are registered be electric starting in 2030. That one was withdrawn. This hearing will probably go on until the wee hours of the morning because again there are 155 amendments, and we will update this list and probably publish a blog post as soon as we know more. But what this means now is that for the rest of the session, once the Senate has passed this bill, the senators will work with the House to try and reconcile the two versions of a climate bill. Again, the House is focused largely on offshore wind. This one is much broader, and we will be doing our best to make sure that the key principles that we outlined at the beginning get incorporated into whatever final bill language the two chambers decide on. So that is the update from Massachusetts. I do want to give one big thank you to those of you who did see our action alert. We sent one out yesterday. We got over 250 people to reach out to their state senators and ask them to support the bill in general and then those amendments in particular. And that's really exciting. So if you are one of those 250, thank you. And if you're not, we will email you again the next time there's an opportunity. So we look forward to working with you then. And I'll turn it back to Mal to talk about Rhode Island.
Thank you. Yeah, it's pretty hard to follow all of the exciting action that's going on in Massachusetts, but I will do my best. So in Rhode Island, we did have a bill filed that aligns with a lot of the principles that we've discussed. It's called the Electric Transportation Act. It was filed by Senator Ilana DiMario and Representative Terry Corbriand. And like the Massachusetts key principles, there are essentially 4 key components of this bill. The first is the regulation component. So as some of you may know, states are not allowed to set their own fuel economy or fuel emission standards. That is something that's established by federal law, except for one really important exception, California. California, under the Clean Air Act that was passed in 1970, has been able to establish its own fuel economy standards because its air quality was really poor in the 70s. And so they got a special waiver to be able to set their own car emission standards. The Clean Air Act also allowed certain states to be able to jump onto California's advanced regulations if they so choose, of which Rhode Island is one. So even though Rhode Island has the ability to adopt California's cleaner standards, it's not required to. And so an important part of the Electric Transportation Act is that it weds Rhode Island's fuel economy standards to that of California. So that means essentially we would jump onto their advanced clean trucks regulations, their advanced clean fleets regulations, and their advanced clean cars regulations, which would establish a 2035 phase-out date, excuse me, for all gasoline-powered cars. So we think that that's really important by taking Rhode Island and kind of attaching ourselves to the largest car market in the country, because clearly Rhode Island has a very small number of cars sold, and we can't change the trajectory of the car market, but we can align with what California is doing. And so we think that that's a really important part of this bill. The second portion is the preparation piece. So Rhode Island actually has the lowest rate of electric vehicle adoption in New England. And so we think a major component of being able to meet the state's climate goals is reversing that trend by adequately preparing an infrastructure, establishing purchase incentives for electric vehicles, which haven't been a thing in Rhode Island since 2017, and doing other key preparation in order to make sure that Rhode Islanders are supported in the transition to more and more electric vehicles. So that 2030 date is not a mandate. Again, it's a way to scale up our planning in a way that's commensurate with the state's climate goals. The third piece, which is a piece that I'm very excited about, is public input. So the bill would establish an equity advisory board to help guide future investments in clean transportation. This is important because, as Anna has noted, cars are not the only part of the solution. We need clean buses, we need clean trucks, we need better walking and biking infrastructure. And in order to kind of balance a lot of these priorities, we think it's really important to have a solid way for the public, particularly those who have been overburdened by air pollution and underserved by the existing systems, to be able to have a say in what our clean transportation future looks like. So that's a really important piece. And then finally, there is a key piece on commitment. So we think that the state should lead by example in the transition to electric vehicles. And so the bill requires that all Rhode Island state vehicle procurements are electric by 2027. That aligns with what the Biden administration has set a goal to do for the federal fleet. And so we think Rhode Island should be moving at least as fast as the vehicles in the federal fleet. So all four of these pieces are for key practical things in order to continue to advance the electric vehicle market in Rhode Island. I want to highlight some of the kind of key preparation elements to scale up EV adoption over the next decade, because, as I mentioned, Rhode Island is behind all of its neighbors. A key thing that I often hear from Rhode Islanders is that there's simply not enough chargers in order for people to feel comfortable switching to an electric car. So part of the scoping plan established in the Electric Transportation Act actually creates a process to figure out how many chargers we need and how we're going to have the workforce to install all of those. So it's a big job, and we think it's going to be a win, especially for electrical workers in Rhode Island who are going to be installing all of those stations. But we need a plan for that. And so the Electric Transportation Act helps us do that. As I mentioned, it's not all about electric cars. Even if we make every vehicle electric as quickly as possible, there's still lots of short trips that are driven that don't necessarily need to be driven. And so if we can invest in a cleaner transit and active mobility system, then we can reduce the total number of miles traveled by vehicles overall, and that'll help reduce emissions, as well as create a more robust, resilient, and multimodal system in which people have options about how they get around. Rhode Island is really small. It's easy to jump on a bus and travel a couple miles and get to your destination. And so we think we should take advantage of the state's size in order to establish a world-class bus system, a great system of trails for walking and biking, and to make it easier so that you don't always have to jump into a vehicle to get to where you need to go. Finally, actually, second to last, we think we need clear directives to the Public Utilities Commission and the utilities in order to prepare our electric infrastructure. The utility in Rhode Island, National Grid, has been really forward thinking about proposing programs to help advance electric vehicles, but National Grid might not always be the utility in Rhode Island, and we need to have a regulatory framework so that expanding the system of electric infrastructure is aligning with what needs to be done to support all the electric vehicles that are coming onto the grid. This also will mean doing smart energy management things like establishing time of use rates in order to make sure that electric cars are charged when they're going to be least taxing to the entire system. And that's also something that's going to help lower fuel costs for EV drivers as well. So we think it's important for state agencies like the DPUC and the PUC to have clear directives about what their role should be in supporting electric vehicles, because that's a new role for them. And so more guidance there is really appropriate and necessary. Finally, this is the piece about leading by example, because the state, if the Electric Transportation Act were to move forward, would have quite a big job ahead of it to prepare for 100% of its vehicle procurements to be electric. So there needs to be adequate planning at the state level to be able to assess which vehicles are going to become electric and when, and then how to charge those vehicles. And we think that the state doing that kind of planning is also going to help municipalities, so cities and towns, do planning of their own to be able to electrify their vehicles. So if we can build that expertise up in the state, then we can also make it easier for other smaller entities to follow the state's lead. And I think it's time to come to questions, but in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we absolutely need the support of Green Energy Consumers members in order to move these efforts forward. We're really excited about what's going on in Massachusetts, and I think having 250 people reach out to their senators is a pretty clear indication that folks are ready for a cleaner, better transportation system. And so in addition to the recording of this webinar, which you'll get by email, be sure to be on the lookout for other ways that you can get involved and support our campaign in both states. And with that, I think it's question time. So Anna, are there any in the questions section that you want to kick us off with?
Yes. So there's one question that is the million-dollar question for us all, which is how are we going to get apartment and condo dwellers the ability to charge their cars? So I thought I can take a stab at this for Massachusetts, and then let you take Rhode Island now. So this is one of the thorny issues that we need to figure out ASAP that needs a little bit more work. So up until this point, the approach that the state has basically taken is that the Department of Public Utilities has allowed our investor-owned electric utilities to put in place what's called a make-ready program, where basically the electric utilities are allowed to use ratepayer funds to cover the costs of bringing electric service to the charging pad in multi-unit dwellings like apartments and condos, workplaces, and public charging stations. So what that means is if you live in a multi-unit dwelling or you are the landlord of a multi-unit dwelling and you want to install charging, this brings the cost of installing charging way down because the electric utility will cover the cost of actually bringing the line to the place where the charging unit is being installed. So as the owner of that building, all you have to pay for is the unit itself and the installation. For a couple of years now, Massachusetts has had a program called Mass EVIP, EVIP, which basically covers the other side of the costs. So for a lot of landlords up until now, they've been able to get support via Make Ready for any trenching that's needed to bring the line to the charging pad, and then Mass EVIP to actually buy the unit and install it. That has been helpful because for a lot of landlords, particularly if any trenching is needed, the cost was just prohibitive. But we need a lot more. Because up until now, mostly these programs have been accessed by larger buildings, so places that have 20+ units and not triple deckers that exist through much of the state. And because the funding and the Mass EVIP program has kind of ebbed and flowed, so it hasn't been consistent enough for that industry to really build up. So in the short term, the electric utilities have proposals that the Department of Public Utilities is about to weigh in on about expanding that program. And there's language in the climate bill that the Senate is debating today that would put a lot more money into helping build out charging infrastructure through programs like Mass EVIP. taking a step back, this particular question is a great example of why we think the state really needs to write a plan for charging infrastructure, because somebody needs to take ownership of that question and help figure it out. The electric utilities are thinking about it, but they're thinking about it from the perspective of we need to serve customers who are interested in this, not from the perspective of we need to get 750,000 electric cars on the road by 2030 to meet our climate goals. So we really need someone at the state to take ownership of that and encourage the electric utilities or direct the electric utilities to do more things like National Grid has a pilot right now in Melrose of putting charging stations on light poles so that people can do on-street charging. There's lots of other things that we could try, but long story short, this question is a key reason why we think language like this around a plan to meet that 2030 target is crucial. But I'll stop talking now and let Mal respond for Rhode Island.
No, that was great. You mostly covered the situation in Rhode Island as well, which is the utility, National Grid, has put a fairly substantial amount of money into installing charging stations for apartment buildings that opt into the program. And so if an apartment building is like really forward thinking or happens to hear from a lot of its tenants like, hey, I want EV charging, then they can opt into that pot of money. But we know that that's not adequate for a few reasons. So as an anecdote, I know a lot of folks that live in condos have told me that it can be really hard to try and convince their condo association, for example, to even try and take advantage of funds that exist because, you know, why would they go through the trouble of this when nobody wants to drive an electric car, right? That's something we hear over and over again is like, if you're one person in a building of 60 and you're the only person asking for electric car charging, it can be hard to make that case. And so that's why we think on top of offering more incentives to be able to cover the cost, having a clear direction about where the market is going can help make that case if you're someone who's trying to convince a stakeholder like a condo association that you should be taking advantage of the existing incentives. And so, for example, if there's a commitment to phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars starting in 2035, then it becomes really clear to the folks that own those properties, like, yeah, this is an asset that we're going to want to have. And so it's helpful for that reason as well. I see another question that I'll ask you, Anna, which is, what is the probable timing and amount of increases in financial incentives for the purchase of new EVs? Do you want to talk about that from the perspective of this new climate bill?
Yes. So the climate bill, the Senate climate bill, is proposing to increase the rebate for new electric cars from $2,500 to $3,500, a range of $3,500 to $5,000, sorry, $3,500 to $5,000 per vehicle. It's also proposing to make it point of sale, extended to used vehicles, and offer an adder if someone is trading in a gas-powered car. That needs to make its way through the legislative process, and we will not know what comes out of that likely until the end of the session. I don't have a lot of optimism that the House and the Senate will figure this out before the very last day of the session. But I would expect to know much more in late June, early July. I don't think that that's sort of responding to the timing question in terms of the amount. I wouldn't expect it to be much larger than what the Senate has proposed, but maybe we'll be surprised. But then the other sort of factor in this mix is what happens, if anything, to the federal tax credit. President Biden had proposed to increase it to $12,000 under certain circumstances, but that is in Build Back Better, and we will find out if that ever gets passed, and if so, in what form. But on the state side in Massachusetts, the update is coming in the early summer. However, there is a meeting of the ZEV Commission tomorrow, which is basically when the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs updates advocates and others about things to do with more EVs. So it may be that in 24 hours I would have a different response, but as of now, that's what we know in Massachusetts.
And I'll just add for folks in Rhode Island wondering the answer to that question, Rhode Island hasn't had a consistent EV purchase rebate ever. The last time we had one was for just 1 year, 2016 to 2017, at which point the program promptly ran out of money because it was so popular. And so we're really excited to note that the Office of Energy Resources has allocated about $1.25 million to reestablish the rebate in Rhode Island starting this summer. Exact program details are to be determined, but we're hoping that after that initial round of funding, there's going to be a larger, more sustainable commitment to continue to provide incentives to folks who are interested in electric cars. And I'll quickly just answer one clarification question that came in. The incentives in Massachusetts are applicable to purchases as well as leases. So you can receive the rebate if you lease. There are some limitations. So you can't use the incentive to buy a car that costs more than $50,000, for example. But the More EV website does a pretty good job of explaining what those limitations are and how you can get the incentive if you do purchase or lease an EV. So I encourage you to check that out. I do see another interesting question in the chat related to the electrification of school buses, specifically the fact that a lot of municipalities in Massachusetts don't own their own school buses, but rather get a third party to offer school bus transportation services. So the question is, are there any opportunities for funding for those transportation providers so that they can electrify their school buses in Massachusetts?
On this one, I will say yes-ish, or yes coming. So the dockets that I mentioned earlier, where our electric utilities are presenting proposals to the Department of Public Utilities, National Grid, as part of their proposal, offered rebates for the purchase of electric school buses for communities in their service territory. And I do believe that they wanted to set that up in a way that municipalities that effectively outsource the ownership of school buses to a third party could still take advantage of those rebates. It remains to be seen whether the DPU will approve that in their final order. So that is sort of pending. I also know that the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is a quasi-state agency that is tasked with basically accelerating the clean energy market in Massachusetts, they have just put out a request for information about a coming electric school bus program. And I believe there are some other resources either in amendments or the actual text of the Senate climate bill that I just mentioned. So that is something we can follow up with you on to make sure we're giving you the most accurate information. But I think this is a space that will see a lot of movement in the next year or so, because people are starting to really get it that school buses are such a great application, both because diesel school buses are such a menace on the public health front, and because there's so many great opportunities to do vehicle to grid integration with electric school buses. So more coming on that soon for sure.
And actually, I'll just make one comment because it seems like the person who asked the question lives in an area that is not served by either National Grid or Eversource. It's a municipal light plant. And so that's one additional reason that we think a lot better planning has to happen on the state level, because it's not fair for people who live in those areas to not be able to access EV charging programs offered by utilities, because the MLPs don't have the capacity or resources to be able to offer them at the same scale as the larger utilities. So we think a bigger statewide effort to coordinate all of those things and not make it utility specific would be really helpful for people in that situation, including yourself. So thank you for asking the question. It was a really good one.
I think with that and seeing that it's 8 o'clock, Mal, if it's okay to wrap this up, I will say that thank you very much to all of you for joining us at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. It's late for my brain, so I appreciate that you came to this. As the previous slide said, it is our 40th year at Green Energy Consumers. So if you enjoyed this and would like to make a contribution to make more webinars like this possible, we would be very grateful. But if you have any questions or would like to follow up with any comments, you can reach out to me for Massachusetts and Mal for Rhode Island. And I think I speak for both of us, and I hope that you enjoyed this and learned something, and we'll be in touch soon with more opportunities to advocate for good policy at the state level. So thank you very much and have a good evening.